At long last, the 2 year battle for the midterms in 2018 has come to a close. The chips are on the floor, and we can finally see what's going on here. And in all honesty, I would hate to be an election accountability board member right now because this one is going to get messy. The final votes for the midterms happened on Tuesday, and now here on Thursday there are races out there that have not officially been called by election boards yet. Mostly it's going to be independent districts, and for the most part we know who's going to have won and who hasn't won. But there's still going to be so much counting and recounting, and I would not be surprised if this remains to be a news story right up until January, when the next Congress is inaugurated. That nice big blue wave that was predicted right from the time that Trump was elected president has fizzled out to next to nothing. The House race pretty much turned out how most people thought it was going to. Actually, it turned out a little bit more in Republicans' favor than most people thought it was going to be. The margin favoring the Democrats being so razor thin, a few ideological Union Democrats who want to switch sides and hope for re-election may throw any legislation that Nancy Pelosi brings forward into a tailspin and into the news story of the year again for the next 2 years coming. And the Senate went back to the Republicans, as most people assumed that it was going to after the Kavanaugh hearings, and even for most parts before, according to polling. It's very likely that the counts and the recounts are going to be major news, as I said, up until January. So I don't want to spend a lot of time analyzing each individual race and all of the close races and figuring out who has won, who has lost, and who's going to have a recount. We're going to have plenty of time for that for the next 2 months. What I do want to do is take some time and talk about some key points that came out of the midterms, a couple of key races, and what this means going forward as we are now in 2020 presidential season, and our election cycling and campaigning is never going to stop. The first thing I want to do is take some time and thank every single constituent Democrat across the country, especially the ones who voted in the key House races that put this razor-thin margin into the House, in which we have no idea what's really going to happen across the next 2 years. You guys have made life so much easier and so much entertaining for people like me. Anybody else who has an independent commentary anywhere on the internet that is not paid for by one of the media giants is never going to run out of things to report on, and some of us might have to up our show count weekly. I've already talked about going up to 3 shows a week in the wake of what I saw on Tuesday night. In an immediate statement, almost immediately after it was proven that the Democrats were going to take the House by their razor-thin margin, Nancy Pelosi came out. It is assumed that she is going to be the Speaker after all, and said that she does not intend to pursue any sort of impeachment hearings or articles of impeachment against the President or anybody that he has nominated, Brett Kavanaugh included. However, I don't think that's going to be a possibility. I think that the Democrats on the ground are going to hold Pelosi and her staffers and her congressional Democrats accountable and force them into the issue. After all, it was something that's been promised to them ever since November 9th, 2016. In fact, now with so much public support in the House that can introduce the articles of impeachment, I have laid some bets out there that by February 1st the articles are going to be introduced, and I pray that it happens. Now, whether or not they can actually introduce the articles of impeachment will come based on the fact that they do need to come up with something in some sort of investigation to introduce the articles of impeachment for. You can't just impeach a president because he says mean things, no matter what the experts on Twitter tell you. That's not the way the Constitution works. However, I do see that on the taxpayer dime, we are going to see endless investigations going on constantly, and they're never going to stop until they find something, and I don't necessarily believe that there's going to be something that they can find. I very strongly predict that there is going to be an impeachment attempt, at least one coming out of the House. Unfortunately for congressional Democrats, I do believe this is going to turn out exactly the same way that it turned out when President Bill Clinton was impeached. Whereas the investigation will go through and the House will be able to draw up an indictment, and then Trump would later get acquitted in the Senate. Impeachment is a very political thing, and that's something to keep in mind. Impeachment is something that was intended to be a constant thing going through by our founders, but it's become something that's rather unpalatable for the majority of the American people. And I do think that if the impeachment attempt goes through, it's going to happen just like it happened in '94. The party that introduced the articles of impeachment is going to get absolutely shellacked in the next election on a national level, and even on the local levels there's going to be party drawbacks for the party that introduces the articles of impeachment. I think Democrats on state and local levels are going to be in very big trouble if they do try to do this. With the partisan divide that we have in this country right now, it is easy to draw the conclusion that legislation has essentially stopped right now for 2019 and 2020. There is not going to be any sort of major legislation now until the next time the Congress goes through, and I think in part that's kind of a good thing going through the country. The stocks sure seem to like the idea. In the wake of a political gridlock coming, the stock market actually opened up on Wednesday morning, and there's reason to believe that with political gridlock, the businesses in this country can plan for what they're going to do for the next 2 years. There's not going to be any sort of major regulation that's going to pass both houses and get signed into law on a federal level. And they know pretty much what regulations are going to be on the table for the next 2 years. I do wish that we could go through and repeal more regulations and be able to grow business more, but I do think this is going to be an advantage for this country, especially going into 2020. One of the big election topics that came up week after week and month after month throughout the last 2 years, as the blue wave that was supposed to be coming ebbed and flowed in the news, was the fact that the ACA was going to be on the ballot this time through. And I do think there's a part of that that holds true, and that's something that we do need to watch. I don't necessarily believe it was strategic. I think it was a small win for congressional Republicans when they had power in both houses, but one of the only things that they were able to do to the ACA was get the individual mandate repealed. Now, congressional Democrats wanted to keep the ACA in place, and the congressional Democrats that are in the House right now are not going to be any different. This was one of their crowning achievements in 2010, and I don't believe that they are going to stop until this is fully re-implemented. But the individual mandate is gone, and the House of Representatives does have the purse strings, and therefore they are the ones that do have to budget for the ACA. What this means is that the House Democrats are going to have to appropriate the funding to take care of the people on the ACA that are not putting into the ACA and the pot itself. With that being said, we have to remember the fact that nobody has to be on insurance anymore by law, and it's going to be very difficult for House Democrats to get a law passed and get it past the Senate and get it to the president's desk where he will sign it. That's going to be a process that's almost impossible for the next 2 years, and then the entire Congress would have to come up with a 2/3 vote combined with Republicans in control of the Senate in order to overturn this and override the president's veto on the bill. The individual mandate is not going to be coming back in the next 2 years, and premiums and deductibles for the ACA are going to have to reflect that, both for people who are contributing and people who are on healthcare.gov and getting the subsidies that are coming from the contributions of the people that are contributing. I apologize, that was kind of a mouthful there. What this means in short is that deductibles and premiums are going to skyrocket, and more people around this country are going to decide that the health care that they desperately need or desperately don't need but want to be in compliance with the law for is not in their budget anymore, and more of them are going to jump off. This would be the point where I would want to caution congressional Republicans right now, because they do need to be careful, as there are members of the House, the most notable being Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, who are advocates for Medicare for all, and there seems to be a rising trend of support for this among constituent Democrats across the country. As much as the ACA has made access to healthcare difficult for the majority of Americans who just want to go to work and get a group rate from their employer, and as much as the ACA has driven up the cost of just simply living in this country, it is something that we do need to tread lightly around, because if we do try to take it and put it out of commission before it's ready, we will be looking down the barrel of single-payer healthcare with enough of a constituency out there to try and push it through, the consequences of which be damned. Before I close this video, I want to touch on one race that I think is going to wind up being newsworthy across the country, and it's something that we're going to have to watch, because I don't think that it's over right now. And that is the race for governor in my home state of Wisconsin. The name Scott Walker has been associated with controversy across this entire country ever since 2010, when Walker signed his iconic Act 10 into law and gained him notoriety with the unions across the entire country. And his failed presidential run didn't help him at all. I think that is part of the reason that we're going to be having this controversy right now to begin with. And I mentioned that in my analysis of Scott Walker when I was talking about reasons that we got Trump. With this being said, there's been a vested interest by people across the country to see Walker get taken out of office. It's easy to see that he was driving a red wave in this state and turned it red for the presidential election for the first time since the 80s. Democrats across the country understand the fact that they will need to win Wisconsin and Pennsylvania as well as Michigan in the upcoming presidential election if they are to have any sort of hope of getting Donald Trump out of office, and that's assuming that impeachment attempts fail. I watched the Wisconsin gubernatorial race up until it ended. I had been paying half attention to it at work, and as soon as I got home from work that night, I started watching it closely. And one of the things that I noticed was that throughout the entirety of the night, Evers and Walker were trading places at the top of the gubernatorial race, and they stayed within 1,000 votes almost the entire night. At the very 11th hour, which actually wound up being the first hour of the next day, with 97% of precincts reporting, there was suddenly a large pack of absentee ballots that were found in Milwaukee County that almost all went to Tony Evers. Under normal circumstances, I don't like to push candidates to open up an investigation into election fraud and simply accept the will of the people in the election. And had Evers been up by 30,000 votes throughout almost the entire night, I probably would be saying the same thing. If this had been a lopsided race, or if Evers had stayed ahead by 1% throughout the entire night. However, the end of this race has not sat right with me ever since I watched it happen. Milwaukee County was showing 100% reported at the time. There were 97% of precincts in Wisconsin reporting, and all of a sudden, out of Milwaukee County, a crop of 30,000 absentee ballots showed up out of nowhere. The news had already been reporting there had been a gluing problem with it, but it's mysteriously enough votes in the race to put Tony Evers up to 1.1% over Scott Walker, with almost every vote in the state counted. For those who don't know, in my state, much like other states, if the vote is within 1%, the election accountability boards that are responsible for the election will trigger an automatic recount. The fact that this was just enough to not trigger an automatic recount on there, that's the part that's not sitting right with me. There's documented written evidence showing me being a staunch supporter of Scott Walker, and there's also documented video evidence out there of me having my differences with the governor of my state. I'm not going to lie and say that I wasn't hoping to see him get primaried this time through, because I do think that things that were said on his presidential campaign tainted his political career. I kind of thought that he was going to be done after this election. With all of that in mind, I do want to say that if Walker were to be removed from office, I do want it to be done the right way. And with all of the staunch opposition to Walker from all unions across the country, there is a part of the ending of this that, as I said, is not sitting right with me. I'm not going to come out and advocate and tell Walker and the Walker campaign to ask for and pay for a recount of the votes. But I can come out here and say honestly from this chair that I'm sitting in front of my entire audience, that I would not denounce him for a second if he did. I'm in a weird situation in our gubernatorial race where no matter which direction Walker decided to go in this, I would stand behind him and support him, whether he did or did not decide to ask for and issue a recount on the election. The political climate in this country has been in chaos for a decade or more at this point, and this coming congressional term is looking already like it's not going to be any different. We're going to have a lot to report on coming up, and we're going to be looking down the barrel of the 2020 presidential elections starting right now. I hope you're ready to sit back and enjoy the show, and I hope that we do see some good things come out of the fact that this term is going to be a complete political chaotic storm. Did you vote this term? And once all the ballots were counted, how many people that you voted for wound up winning their races? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comment section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at EdsBlog Twitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care. You're